Hi, my name is Josh Chilton, and today we are going to be talking about a topic near and dear to my heart, which is addiction, alcoholism, recovery. And we are going to be critiquing a video interview involving two evangelical Christians who are involved in the treatment, addiction, recovery community, and industry. So I should probably start by just saying, I know firsthand, from firsthand experience, that addiction is a monster that devours anything and anyone close to it. Many times in active addiction, I felt alone, confused, terrified, rejected, ashamed until I reached a state of just like utter hopelessness that one book of recovery uses a good term, the best term that I've heard to describe it, which is I reached a state of pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization. I should also emphasize that addiction is a family disease. The loved ones of the addict or the alcoholic suffer just as much, if not more, than the person who is in active addiction. Loving an addict in active addiction can lead to maybe even a greater sense of fear and hopelessness and demoralization. And sometimes the pit of grief that a loved one feels when they lose the person they care about to addiction is something, it's just something that no human should ever have to experience. And I say all that just to say, before we get into this, addiction is real. It is truly that monster I was describing, and it can seem impossible to defeat once it gets a hold of you. And nothing I say in this video is meant to discourage anyone from getting help anywhere that is offered. I want that to be clear. If you are battling with alcoholism, addiction, any type of chemical dependence of any sort, and a Christian based treatment center or group therapy is offered to you, if that seems like a viable path to you, or God forbid, it's the only option available to you in your area, I urge you strongly to consider taking that help that is available. But with that being said, you should also know that there is a global network of recovery out there in this world that can be accessed and reached with the touch of a few buttons, either on your phone or on your computer or throughout the communities you live in, if you live in a relatively, large city. But whatever you decide, it is never too late to get help. As long as there is air in your lungs and you are breathing and your heart is beating, no matter how low you feel, no matter how hopeless and ashamed of what you've done, no matter how much that hurts you, like it's not too late for you. There are many paths to choose from, and you may stumble along the way, but do not let that stop you. The most important part of my recovery from the disease of addiction was me realizing that the Josh plan doesn't work. I could never do it alone. I needed help. So, with that being said, in today's stream, we are going to listen to an interview and critique some of the ideas expressed by two Christians who are talking about the nature of the disease of addiction, what quote unquote secular addiction treatment looks like, and human conceptions of core identity, and a whole lot more. So let's just get started. I'm going to pull up this screen here. We've got a man named R.L. Solberg. He runs a nonprofit. It seems to be a nonprofit college called Biblical Roots Ministries. And on the right is, ironically, and it's kind of cool, someone who went to high school with me. Her name is Sarah Keel, and she runs a Christian-based rehabilitation center in Knoxville, Tennessee, called the Renew Center. So we're going to get into this interview, and we're just going to talk about some of the things that they touch on along the way.
So talk a little bit about that work that you've done there.
Sure. And I think that in the addiction recovery space, that is the first question to ask. What does it mean to be human? Because whatever the industry says about that, or whatever the clinician or the therapist believes about what it means to be human, is going to govern treatment. It's also going to govern what they believe recovery is.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because who are you trying to heal? If you're, this is a human I'm trying to heal and get them to a better place.
Yeah.
How are they? What's their makeup? I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. And what's the eschatology of a human being? Like, what's the end goal of humanity? And it's eternity, really. And so one of the mega narratives where we can really see this playing out in the secular addiction recovery world, and this is said verbatim, that addiction is a brain disease. It's not a moral failure. And at first glance, a Christian can hear that and say, well, tell me more. And the reason they say that is because they want to reduce stigma. It's a campaign slogan to reduce stigma, because, from a secular perspective, in order for people to be loved, they cannot be morally responsible for their actions. In order for people to be accepted and not judged, they cannot not have morally failed.
So I want to respond to a little bit of what was said there. First, you can notice the distinction that is always made between faith-based recovery, Christian-based recovery, and what they call secular recovery. And Sarah is critiquing the idea that we talk about often in clinical settings. I've heard it talked about that addiction is a brain disease. And so kind of what Sarah is explaining follows from that is that you're not morally responsible for the things you did while you were in addiction, because your brain was just doing something out of control that you couldn't, there was nothing you could really do about it. But, I want to add a little nuance to why, some clinicians may say addiction is a brain disease. I've also heard it said in group therapies and addiction treatment centers, you're not a bad person trying to get good. You are a sick person trying to get well. And yes, those terms are used as a direct way to counter the stigma that followed alcoholics and addicts for generation upon generation in a society that told them, you are just a bad person, you're weak, you're a moral failure, and you're just, there's no redemption for you. And I can get how saying addiction is a brain disease, saying that alone might sound a little deterministic, like you have no control over it. It may sound reductionist to some people, but I think that's like a somewhat common misunderstanding. I think saying addiction is a brain disease is simply a way to denote that addiction has an undeniable neurobiological component to it. And I think Sarah and RL here would even, agree with that statement. calling something a disease. There's this paper that I've linked in the description from 2021, and it's called Addiction as a Brain Disease Revised and Why It Still Matters. And it's 2021 by Marcus Heilig in the Journal of Neuropsychopharmacology. Pharmacology. Can hardly get it out. And kind of what they say, and they talk about, there may be needs to revise how we talk about addiction as a brain disease. But he just kind of breaks it down into different areas and addresses different parts of that critique. What does it mean to have a disease? A disease just means that the medical community has created this word, disease, a label to describe a cluster of substantial deteriorating changes in the structure or function of a human body. So it's simply a way to describe a constellation of co-occurring problems that impair the proper functioning of the body. And so if you want to deny the neurobiological element and all of the data and science and research behind that, I would challenge you to do that and be able to come up with some idea about addiction that doesn't encompass that. But that same critique, you would have to use the same line of thinking against the idea that other psychiatric disorders like bipolar or schizophrenia are brain diseases as well. But I think calling addiction a brain disease is not saying that addiction is only a brain disease, right? It's not less than a brain disease, but it's also a whole lot more than a brain disease. It is nuanced. It involves biology, your environment, culture, and society, and yes, even spirituality. Like, if you look at the combined data of research studies, treatment guidelines, surveys of treatment centers, and expert opinions, you're going to see that an estimated, what the numbers I found, between 70 to 90% of treatment centers in the United States recommend participation in 12-step groups. Now, what is a 12-step group? A 12-step group would describe itself as a spiritual program of action. So since the writing of the original Alcoholics Anonymous book in 1938, there has been a wide consensus amongst secular clinicians that there is some aspect to the disease of addiction that is spiritual in nature. They might not use the word spiritual, but they have decided collectively, between 70 and 90% of them at least, like, that they need to humble themselves and realize that there's a part of this thing that can't be solved through just science, counseling, psychiatric medicine. Like, there's another element to this. And even Dr. Silkworth, who wrote a little part in the preamble to the book Alcoholics Anonymous called The Doctor's Opinion, admits the limited ability of clinicians to treat alcoholism. Like, he says, like basically he believes that a psychic change needs to occur And the only way he has seen that occur is by people taking the 12 steps, and that can do much more for the alcoholic addict than any measure of moral condemnation, therapy, or other medical options that they would have like otherwise. And so like the other part I need to address is from a secular perspective. People, what did she say? Like, they say that so that people cannot be judged morally. And I think it's important to like kind of flesh that out a little bit. So I'm gonna, since I'm yapping so much, we'll go back to the video, and I promise we'll review a lot more of the video. But there was a lot in that little, just in that little, few sentences that we need to dissect a little bit. To me, that seems like a category error when she says that secular treatment centers are saying this because the secular world, cannot condemn someone morally, because if they do so, then those people would have to be held morally responsible for their actions. And, I just have a few questions from that. Like, my first question is like, what does secular mean? Like, what secular perspective is this? Like, the word secular in like common terms today just means like without regard to or neutral towards religion. And so like, where like should, when you go to see the doctor, or you get I was recently in a hospital that was a quote unquote secular setting. Was it that secular setting's job to morally condemn me? If I go to McDonald's, which is a secular restaurant, is it the guy who's making my burger at McDonald's? Is it his job to talk about my moral life? University classroom, is it the teacher's job, the professor's job to morally condemn a student? Of course not. We wouldn't think like that. Even in, legal secular spaces, it's more about taking responsibility for your actions. But secular spaces are not necessarily the place where people should be looking for love or for moral teaching. Like, when I think about where people should look for those type things, I think about family, I think about friends, I think about religion, I think about spirituality. I just think it's a category error to say that, like, from a secular treatment perspective, the goal is to not let people be held morally responsible for their failings. And there's also another element, because 90% of treatment centers, 70 to 90% of treatment centers recommend you go to 12-step treatment groups. Those 12-step treatment groups really do get into some moral aspects of what has been going on. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go.
Just doesn't fit into the framework. And so what they do is they remove moral responsibility in order for people to not be judged and for them to seek treatment. And at first glance, a Christian, could say, yeah, sounds good. I love compassion. I love reducing stigma. I love people getting help. I love not judging people.
Is that a Christian stance, Sarah? When you think of evangelical Christians, do they love not judging people? Do they love compassion, especially for the immigrant? That's just a little dig, but come on now.
But I think we need to think more critically about that statement, because if we remove moral responsibility, we remove the need for salvation and the need for the gospel and Jesus Christ. And if they were anything like me, my heart was so fertile for the gospel because of how much I'd messed up. And I don't think it would have been helpful to me if somebody came up to me and said, hey, no, you're fine. You haven't sinned. You're morally okay. You just have a brain disease. That would not have led me to.
It rings empty, doesn't it?
It's so empty.
Again, this is just reductionist. No one's saying that you just have a brain disease, but people are saying that, yes, you do have a brain disease, and you have there's a lot more aspects to it. And also, like, what help is it really going to do, to, bash someone, beat them over the head with their moral failings? Like, one thing I could say as someone who has experienced active addiction is, like, I was ashamed enough. Like, I didn't need more people shaming me at the very beginning. There was a time and place where I needed to take moral responsibility for my actions, my past actions, even though I had a brain disease. And there was a time and place for me to try to make those things right. But it was not when I arrived at treatment's door. I just needed some understanding about what the hell was going on with me. Why was I acting like such a crazy person? And I think that's kind of what is missing in this part of the conversation.
And you know that, like, I'm talking to people, again, in prisons and recovery centers, they already understand that part of that is the shame they're dealing with, that they know they've messed up. They know there is instinctively, they know there's some moral culpability there.
Yeah, it actually creates cognitive dissonance to deny it.
Yeah.
And it just further complicates it, right? But it ultimately removes the reality of the soul. The implication is if there's no moral responsibility, then there's no moral agency. There's no immaterial reality governing what's going on here. So the removal of the soul. And I think you can trace it back to this debate in neuroscience.
So I have to ask, because I've dipped my...
So she's talking about the debate in moral science. I don't know which aspect of moral science she's talking about. But when it comes to responsibility and philosophical perspectives on philosophy of the mind, or whether it's even out to like metaphysics, whatever someone, and they talk a lot about worldviews, you could be a philosopher, and most people don't even ever get this deep into philosophical positioning of what they think about the universe. But most philosophical materialists, determinists, compatibilists, naturalists, atheists, even fatalists, like, believe that whether there is a soul or whether they agree about what consciousness is or isn't, they all seem to come together to believe that we have to act like people's actions matter and people should be held morally accountable for their actions, if only to preserve order in society. So I don't think there's any removing of the soul within treatment centers. I just think, like, that's not their job. Like, it's not their job to morally condemn, and it's not their job to talk about the soul. From my experience, a quote unquote secular treatment center's job is to provide knowledge of the neurobiological aspect of addiction, provide group therapy, one-on-one therapy, and then push people out into 12-step groups, which are going to deal with the spiritual side of addiction. Again, 70 to 90% of treatment in the secular world is going to get you so far as to understand a little bit more about addiction, talk about it a little bit in groups. But I've been in these treatment centers. Basically, they get to a point where they say, okay, like, insurance is kicking you out in a few days. Like, it's time to start asking questions. Are you going to meetings? Have you found a sponsor? Because they know and recognize their limitations. And so, like, you know, what else can you ask them to do? Like, it's crazy.
My toe enough in that world. It seems to me your position would ruffle a whole lot of feathers. Are you in a, what we might call a minority position in the larger industry?
Oh yeah,
mental health?
I'm a dissenter.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, I never agreed with it. I'll say that. But, I think that this would fall into the same category as,
You never agreed with what, Sarah? I'd like some clarity on that. You never agreed that addiction is, at least part of addiction is as a brain disease, because your website seems to indicate that you do believe that, or is that you don't believe there's any moral, you're going against the grain because you say there's moral culpability that your treatment center offers that other treatment centers don't offer. Again, they're all pushing us out to 12-step groups so that we can deal with the spirit, so that we can deal with the moral side of everything. And like, they're basically making it so we can't claim ignorance about our situation anymore. Like, before I went to treatment, I could claim ignorance of how addiction worked, and, because I didn't know how it worked, and I could blame it all on me being a terrible human being, my parents, how they treated me growing up, like, up until the point that I discovered that most of the time my disease was in control much more than I was. Like, I would have perfectly, like I would realize finally that, like, perhaps I wouldn't have done all the bad things I did while I was addicted had I not been chemically and psychologically dependent on substances. Like, would I have, like, robbed my mother's purse if I wasn't, like, addicted to chemical substances? Like, it's all a setup. Secular treatment is all a setup to help patients reach a place where they can accept a holistic solution that involves looking at the moral and the spiritual aspects of addiction.
in the field of biology, those that are evolutionary biologists and those who believe in intelligent design,
Right.
blacklisted in academia, their articles aren't published, they're viewed as as extremists or whatever. And so I think that this would fall into the same category. It is definitely a stronghold and a strongly held belief within the addiction recovery community, because they think it's what helps people. And if
Right.
you don't believe that, you're harming people. That's the deceptive nature of it.
Yeah. And it's because it's not some onerous outward sign or evidence of harm. It's an internal thing.
Yeah.
It's an internal emptiness. And I agree. And the other thing too, it feels almost like when you cut that off, you're sort of cutting off, almost like you're cutting off the vitamins or the nutrients of who a human being is, and saying, no, it's not, it's just a brain problem. We run into this sometimes in apologetics when you hear these materialist folks say, well, there is no free will. You're just responding to the synapses firing in your brain.
Up for an adventure?
Always.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Right? They're doing the exact same thing. They're removing moral agency, and they're saying every decision you make is predetermined by your exposure in your environment and the way your synapses are firing.
Exactly. And you mentioned earlier about scientism. So
Yeah.
that statement,
Predeterminism? Are we talking about predeterminism here? Again, like I said before, no matter what your philosophical position is regarding, the meta reality that we live in or the philosophy of mind, everyone has pretty much agreed that we at least have to act like people are accountable for their actions to preserve civil society. And when it gets to determinism, I would encourage RL and Sarah to talk to their Calvinist and Reformed Christian brothers and sisters, because in that version of Christianity, there is no free will. Like, you are just playing out what God decreed from the beginning of time according to his will. You can look at verses like Romans 8:29 or Ephesians 1:4-6. Here's what Ephesians 1:4-6 says. For he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. In love, he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ in accordance with the pleasure and his pleasure and his will, to praise of his glorious grace, which he has freely given us, the ones he loves. Like, so basically what that's saying is, and what the theology that comes out from that ends up, what it ended up developing into is that you have elect people and you have non-elect people. And so the elect people are the people that God chose from the beginning of time to be true Christians, accept salvation through Jesus Christ, and they are the ones to get to go to heaven. But if you are non-elect, if you are what they call a reprobate, you were not chosen from the beginning of time to receive salvation. So from that standpoint, it's pure determinism from determined by God, and whether you go to heaven and whether you go to hell is not because of anything you did. It's because what God decreed for his pleasure from the beginning of time. So when we start talking about like determinism and stuff like that, like we got to be very careful, because there's a large sect of Christians who believe in determinism as well.
Addiction is a brain disease, not a moral failure. That's not a scientific statement. That's a philosophical statement called scientism.
Yeah.
But people don't realize that. It's like, not everybody's read on this stuff,
It is not a scientist's job to make a philosophical assumption or statement regarding the science that they're doing. You understand, like, there's categories, Sarah. Like, a scientist can study the neurobiological element of addiction and say nothing about moral culpability. A psychologist can study, whatever psychologists study about addiction. And they can perhaps start to delve into morality and what is a person's morality, what is their subjective experience, and how do they live up to their own standards of morality or the standards of morality of their belief system, which might be Christianity. But there are different places where people do different things. And so you can't expect a scientist who's studying the brain to make moral statements. And like I said, scientists and doctors have long since decided, mostly 70 to 90%, that there's another side of this that they can't help with. And so saying addiction is a brain disease is not saying that it's only a brain disease. I feel like I have to say that over and over here.
Glance, it's not going to be caught by everyone. And they tout it around as science, as hard science. And people don't realize, no, that's a philosophical statement.
So playing devil's advocate, if you were to get pushback, I imagine they would say, well, we've got scientific studies. There is some chemical issue. Addiction does have a component that's physical, or, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I would say that Christians have no problem with scientific study of addiction and how it affects the brain, and recognizing what the healing process physically will entail for someone who's been using drugs, and to understand some of the behavioral aspects of addiction that are associated with how the brain's affected. I don't think any Christian has a problem with that. What we have a problem with is the philosophical statement that there's no moral failure, that there are no moral implications.
Who's made that statement? So I'm going to cut ahead just a little bit. I just don't know who is making that statement. That just feels like a straw man. And sorry for the ad, y'all. It's I'm not paying for YouTube Premium, not at this point.
So and so, I'm an alcoholic, I'm a drug addict. That always struck me as odd. That I understand that's an experience, but does it need to be a label? Is there a thought behind why it's done that way?
Yeah, I think people
So here they're talking about identity. And so if you've ever been to a treatment center or in a 12-step meeting, you might hear someone stand up or sit down and say, "Hi, my name is so-and-so, and I'm an alcoholic. Hi, my name is so-and-so, and I'm an addict. Hi, my name is so-and-so, and I'm in recovery." And so that's the context for what we're talking about here.
Afraid to forget what their vulnerabilities are, and they're afraid to forget what they've been delivered from and what they need to stay away from, right? And so I think that that's the heart and motive behind saying I'm an addict the rest of their lives. They think there's this fear attached to, if I stop calling myself that, I'm going to forget, and then I'm going to go back, or I'm not owning this part of me that needs to be addressed.
Right. And but it's also it's labeling them.
It is.
A friend of mine, he likes to say, "I have 7 years of victory over alcohol." He doesn't want to say I'm an alcoholic. So
I love that.
He's still remembering, but he's not making that his title.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And the Bible doesn't expect us to do that. I see no instruction where we have to label ourselves by our sin struggles the rest of our life.
And I've heard people in meetings say, like, "I'm so-and-so, I'm in recovery." Or, yeah, if someone in a meeting said, "I'm so-and-so, and I have 7 years of victory over alcohol," like, no one's going to turn to them and be like, "How dare you say that? Our identity for life is that we are addicts and alcoholics, and this is a disease that can never go away." Even if the literature of the 12-step books says this is a disease that needs to be treated on a daily basis, like, no one's going to get at you for that, just for saying that. And as far as like how I consider it is, yeah, I'll say, "My name is Josh, I'm an addict in recovery." That's how I say it. But like that, for me, that's not an entire identity statement. Like, that's a statement I'm making in the context of being at a meeting with a bunch of other people who have the same problem. Like, I'm also a son, a brother, an uncle, a friend, a writer, a student, a human being in search of spiritual growth. Like, I could throw all of these, labels and identifications on myself, but I don't think, and maybe some people take it too far, and that's a good critique, but I just don't think, saying that within the context of a 60-minute meeting is limiting my personhood or making it out as if that's the only thing that I am.
Lives, I mean, it's
Right.
like, "Hey, I'm Sarah. I struggle with anxiety, control, whatever." I mean, there is nothing wrong with confessing our sins, keeping them in the light.
Amen. Yeah.
But that's not who we are. That's not our identity.
Yeah, right. And identity is a huge thing.
Yeah.
So I'm imagining then, from your perspective, from a Christian perspective in the recovery world at Renew Clinic, when people come in, when you're looking at the folks that you're helping, you're saying, look, these are all humans with great worth and great dignity that have fallen into hard times or they're having some struggles. So I can see how taking that approach leads you to look at them differently and approach the problem differently than if you said.
And I just want to throw in real quick, like, as long as we're talking about identity, like, I'm sure RL and Sarah would have no problem. She said there's no biblical teaching that requires us to name our sins like that. But I do, like, I've been to church enough to, there's like repentance, and like there's this, after the fall of Adam, that humanity is inherently sinful. And so could she not stand up at church and say, "Hi, my name is Sarah and I'm a sinner"? Like, I think that would pretty much go with Christian doctrine. building, or I'm a sinner in recovery, saved by the blood of my Lord and Savior Jesus, like something like that. Like, I feel like this whole identity thing, evangelicals like these two want you to place your full identity in your Christian life. But there's no but they were trying to say, like, comparing that to AA, someone saying I'm an alcoholic or I'm an addict, like, they do the same thing. They just say I'm a sinner, right? So,
That look at all these people that have brain disease like it's a cancer ward.
Yeah.
Right, which would be more of a clinical thing.
Right. Right.
So how does the program work?
I would love to see a treatment center where everyone is treated as if it's a cancer ward, and everyone has just like no personal or care taken for them or anything like that. Like, I think that's just a complete straw man of what addiction and recovery centers look like. I'm going to skip ahead to kind of the last little section I wanted to look at. I think
we gotta go.
Which ultimately draws them into, with the ultimate purpose of drawing them into a right relationship with the Lord.
Right.
And so it's unique, and we have a lot of, by God's grace, we have a lot of graduates that have built a community and still get together, and it's just a sweet thing that's being built out of Renew. So
that's beautiful. When you're talking about the two levels of relationships, almost horizontal and vertical,
yes,
it just brought me right to the greatest commandment. The man asked Jesus, what's our greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart. So this is a vertical thing. And the second is like it, love your neighbor. And it's interesting that your framework is built along those same things, where we need connection in both directions.
Thank you for drawing that connection for me. I'm going to do that now. You're
okay.
Right.
It's yours, yeah. It reminds me of, I forgot who told the story or where I read it. I'm the worst at this sort of thing. I always paraphrase everything. Yeah. But this concept of mankind having this enlightenment throughout the early scientific era and trying to climb this mountain of knowledge and
I just want to say real quick, I know I cut in too much, like, maybe you guys didn't invent that idea. Like, again, 12-step recovery programs. The vertical part is the program, your relationship and dependence on a higher power to keep you sober. And then the horizontal is you're hanging out with the fellowship, which means the other people in the 12-step group, and you're doing service work to help contribute. So there is a vertical and horizontal element of 12-step work that is very similar to what they're talking about.
Understand how the world works and how things are set up, and all these scientists climb their way to the top, and when they look over to the top, they see all these theologians who had been there for centuries.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, well, okay, we could have told you that there was an emotional component. Yeah. I love that, because the big thing for me as an apologist,
I'm not sure what he's talking about there either, that scientists, so he kind of took a hit at the Enlightenment, and so since the Enlightenment, scientists have done all these discoveries, and then that once they reached the mountaintop of scientific discovery, they realized that there were theologians who had had that level of knowledge all along, and they were just waiting there, waving to say hi to them. Like, I don't know if that's like necessarily true. Like, could theologians have told Einstein, who was a deist, about the theory of general relativity? Like, I don't think so. Or Isaac Newton, who I know he at least denied the Trinity. He had his own set of private beliefs. Were theologians just waiting there once he discovered the theory of gravity to be like, yep, we just been waiting here all along to tell you about that theory of gravity? Methinks not.
and as a Christian, is just the thing that I love about the Christian faith is it's so heavily laden with reality.
Yeah.
It's tied directly into the timeline of human history, right? The dust and the dirt and the blood of humanity isn't some abstraction, right? Christianity deals with all this stuff. And if anyone that's a fan of the Old Testament will see how often we go wrong and how many things, as what the Ecclesiastes, I think, says, there's nothing new under the sun. Oh yeah, we've got all the things you see on, whatever, in the movies today or on reality TV is all stuff that's happened and been happening forever. Yeah. And so when you get a sense of something like, okay, the reality I see is so well explained by this faith system, this understanding of a creator God and him coming to earth and, the world being fallen, because no matter who you are, you ask somebody, in your opinion, is the world as it should be right now, or does it need to be improved? Everybody of every religion and culture is going to say, oh no, the world is messed up.
Yeah.
And so then the question becomes why? And Christianity has the answer, I think, that no one else does.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to, gosh, I don't want to do this to you, RL. So RL is talking about how Christianity explains the most about the reality that we see around us at any day and time and stuff like that. And, I don't know, man, when I read the Bible, there's things that I see and read about that we do not see those things today. We do not see talking snakes. We did not see a demon-possessed man whose demons were transferred over to a pack of pigs who ran off a cliff, I think, or something. We do not see talking burning bushes. We do not see God sending 2 bears to maul a group of 42 kids who mocked one of his servants for their bald hair. We do not see zombies rising, the dead rising, all the saints in Matthew 27 when Jesus resurrected. We do not see Noah's Ark and the entire world being flooded and every animal, 2 kinds of every animal getting on some huge boat. More realistic to me is that we see people believing that God commanded this or that, and we see people believing that it's okay to genocide an outgroup, which is what we see a lot in the Old Testament. We see people believing that slavery is okay because God regulated slavery and the relationships between individuals, tribes, and nations. The whole story of, Adam and Eve in the garden, the fall, and then the necessary redemption through Jesus Christ. I could get into all that in another video and kind of break down why that doesn't quite explain the world I see around me and some of the bits and pieces of that story that don't quite add up, but I'll save that for another time. But just that statement that, this explains, this explains the world we see around us more than anything else. I would just beg to differ just a little bit. All right, I'm going to cut ahead one more time and then we'll be just about done. All right, so I'm going to cut ahead to 1:01.
Christ daily,
Yeah.
and have to do that work of dying and to live for Christ. So
when I did the 12-step study group with the Celebrate Recovery, and I think it was 9 months long. Every week for 9 months, we would all get together, the guys, and talk through stuff. And it was a wide range. It was chemical stuff. It was personal things. It was trauma, whatever we were healing from. What I noticed just jumped out at me within the first few sessions was wait a second, this is almost like sanctification. Yeah. This is the process of God saying, oh, I can't do it, but God can. Yeah. Right. And I need to learn how to let him do this in my life because he wants to do it. And that was, for me, that was the biggest problem. I've never doubted God could do things, but to say, well, he's, you get that old lie of the enemy. He's pretty busy. He might get to you next week. I know. He's the living God of the universe. But I just say that to echo what you're talking about, that all Christians are in recovery. Nobody's where they need to be. Right. And some of it includes substance abuse. Some of it is triggered by horrible, very real traumas, especially childhood traumas. Those things are all real and legitimate, but the path to healing is the same.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, the 12 steps are biblical steps. I mean, when they were developed, Bill W., he consulted with Christians to develop the 12 traditions and 12 steps. And I think that's why people who are not even Christians have benefited from the 12 steps, because anytime you obey anything that comes from the Lord, your life will be better for it.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean that there's salvation attached to it. The 12 steps aren't necessarily equivalent to salvation. Obviously, it's only in Christ, but the 12 steps are biblical, and that's why they work, I would say. So,
all right, Sarah, I'm going to have to critique your theology a little bit. Even as a non-Christian, I'm going to have to critique your theology. So from what I understand, sanctification only comes after justification. So you have to be justified. In other words, you have to believe that Jesus died for your sins, that whole thing. You have to be justified, and then the Holy Spirit comes within you to sanctify you. And so saying that the 12 steps are, they're good because they're based on biblical principles, but they're not like good enough for like salvation. And that doesn't quite add up to me, because, us 12 steppers out here, like, we're not giving our life, not all of us. There's a lot of Christians in these 12 step groups out here. And Christianity, to me, is perfectly compatible with the 12 steps of recovery. But there's a lot of us out here who are giving our will and our lives over to the care of the universe, over to the care of karma, over to the care of Buddhism, the sun, atheists who give their life and their care over to the group of drunks, good orderly direction. Or like, what if a 12 stepper, God forbid, use Satan as their higher power? Did they enjoy God's sanctification? Not redemption, not salvation, but God's sanctification, because they're involved with the 12 steps. And like even for me, like, my higher power mostly revolves around like a cause and effect experience. Like, I don't try to define what God is or isn't. Like, I'm kind of a agnostic who leans towards like deism. But like, I believe that if I practice the principles of surrender to a higher power, honesty, hope, faith, courage, willingness, humility, acceptance, forgiveness, love, integrity, self-discipline, service, like if I embrace those, what I believe to be spiritual principles, which are almost written into the fabric of reality, that the cause of me acting on those principles is going to create an effect of spiritual growth and fulfillment. Like, and to me, spirituality can be as simple as living in the now, living in the present moment, free from past or future thoughts. And I don't need this like certainty about the afterlife for me to like feel like my life is worth something, or that my life has purpose. And so I want to end this video with a hypothetical question that I hope, if RL or Sarah ever watches this video, that they might be able to answer this question. Because at one point, we didn't watch it in the video, but at one point she talks about apologetics and having every Tuesday night an open apologetics seminar where people from the recovery community, even those who aren't in their program specifically, are invited to come in and ask questions. And so this question, this hypothetical, is something that's always bothered me and been a hindrance to me believing fully in Christianity. And so I'm just going to propose it and see kind of, because we're talking about morality here, right? We're really putting a heavy emphasis on the importance of morality. So let's just go through this hypothetical. All right, in this hypothetical, there is person A and there is person B. Person A. Person A is an alcoholic man in his 40s with a history of moderately neglecting his family responsibilities. At 40, he decides to go to AA and get sober. He works the 12 steps with a sponsor, and he finds a higher power, which he ends up calling divine nature. Having grown up in an abusive Christian family environment, his choice for calling his higher power divine nature is deliberate. It's something separate from his Christian upbringing, but something that makes sense to him, something that he can relate to in terms of surrendering his life to it. He finds his higher power on nature walks, hiking, and through Buddhist-based meditation. And during his working of the 12 steps, he makes a fearless and searching moral inventory. He gives up his worst character defects, takes a daily inventory, and rights his wrongs quickly. He joins a meditation center. He volunteers 10 hours of weekly service to helping other alcoholics get sober. Over a 30-year period, he makes amends to those he neglected and hurt and becomes a better husband, a better father, and an eventual grandfather and provider for his family until he dies at the age of 70. So that's person A. Person B. Person B is a drug addict man in his 40s who has never listened to anyone who's ever told him he has a problem with drugs and alcohol. He is prone to violence, whether he's intoxicated or not, and frequently finds himself assaulting elder persons for money for his next fix. One night, he is starved for some affection and catches a lady trying to get to her car while leaving a bar at the late evening hours in the night. As he pushes her to the ground, this lady he has assaulted and pulls her to the ground into a back alley in order that he might have his way with her. The woman's husband rushes to her defense, as he was not far behind because he was paying the bar tab and saying goodbye to some friends. The husband beats the man with a weapon to the point of near death, and the drug-addicted man ends up in the emergency room. As he is slowly dying over the next day or two in the hospital with internal bleeding and a subdural hematoma, a kind nurse decides to ask him if he knows Jesus. She ends up reading the prayer to the man and asked him to admit his sins to Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who was sent to earth to die for his sins and for the sins of all those who choose to believe. The man invites Jesus into his heart and asks forgiveness for his sins just minutes before taking his final breath. So my question is, who, from a moral standpoint, deserves to go to heaven, and who deserves to be separated from God in eternal conscious torment? That's the question I'm going to leave you with. Was it the man who chose the wrong higher power, but took responsibility for himself, made amends for the things he did wrong, and spent the next 30 years taking care of his family until he finally dies? Or was it the drug addicted man who constantly robbed elder people and tried to rape a woman on the night he was killed, and at his last moment decided to turn his life over to the care of Jesus? Which one of those, from a moral standpoint, deserves to go to heaven, and which one deserves to be separated from God in eternal conscious torment? And that is what I will leave you with, folks. I appreciate everyone who's watching. And Sarah, if you did happen to catch any of this, I would love to do a live stream and we can just talk back and forth. And for the rest of you, I will have a new video coming out hopefully next week. Please like, please subscribe. I would really, really appreciate it. And we'll see you next time.